Now, for the vendors, if everything is structured properly, the vendor can get a couple good things coming out of this, really. The big tax incentive is if it's structured properly, you get the $10 million capital gains deduction on the sale, which is quite an incentive. The typical lifetime capital gains exemption is also still available and can be stacked with it, but that's usually more in the realm of about, I think it's $1.25 million currently for each individual, whereas the $10 million for a sale to the employee ownership trust is a considerably bigger number.
Welcome to Beyond Succession, a podcast series within the Bennett Jones Business Law Talks podcast that discusses topics around navigating the complexities of the family enterprise. I'm Leah Tolton, partner at Bennett Jones LLP, and I'm a family enterprise and corporate lawyer, passionate about helping family enterprise businesses navigate the complexities of governance, succession, and growth. Before we begin this podcast, please note that anything said or discussed on this podcast does not constitute legal advice. Always seek proper advice from your legal advisor, as every situation is different and outcomes can vary. In this episode, we're exploring a new succession strategy that is reshaping the future of Canadian private business ownership, employee ownership trusts, or EOTs as they're called. Introduced into Canadian tax law in 2024, EOTs are a unique mechanism for business owners seeking a legacy-driven exit that rewards their employees and preserves their company culture. This structure allows for a business to be sold to a trust that benefits all employees, such as enabling ownership without direct capital investment, while offering significant tax incentives to vendors, including a potential $10 million capital gains deduction. To discuss this innovative model, I'm joined by my colleague Wes Novotny, a partner at Bennett Jones and a key legal architect in Canada's EOT movement. Wes advised on Canada's first domestic EOT transaction, led advocacy efforts alongside the Canadian Employee Ownership Coalition, and in my opinion, is now one of the country's go-to advisors for business owners considering this route. Wes, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks, and nice to be here, Leah. Always fun to talk about EOTs, something new in the Canadian commercial and tax landscape, and a real positive development.
Great. Well, let's get started then. And let's start with the basics. Can you share with our listeners what exactly is an employee ownership trust, and why is it so significant that Canada now has this structure available?
Yep. So what an EOT is it is just in effect, a regular Canadian trust, but it has some unique characteristics to it that lead it to have certain tax outcomes, which are very positive, both potentially for the vendors and also for employees. It's a new succession vehicle is really what it is. So if you have a current business and taking, very, very simple model and a kind of simple example, you got a vendor, let's say they're an individual, they own an operating company that has a business. Who do you sell this thing to? Traditionally, it might be your competitors. It might be private equity. It might be somebody doing similar things to you who wants to grow their business. Could potentially even be family if they want to take it over. Well, the EOT offers kind of a new option to do that. You settle a trust. The trust has some unique characteristics. The beneficiaries of the trust are the employees of the business. And so they are effectively indirectly becoming owners of the business to benefit from whether it's the profits of the business, ultimately in terms of effectively profit sharing, or ultimately if the company is sold, they can participate in the growth and value of the company. So that's the unique piece for the employees. They are the beneficiaries of this trust and indirectly the beneficiaries of the business. Mm-hmm. And in addition, for the employees, if this is all structured right, the EOT allows the purchase of the business from the vendor to occur with the profits of the business, which is quite a unique structure. But effectively, this trust, beneficiaries of the employees, trustees will be a mix of people, but it has to have some employee representation, cannot have too much representation from the vendor who's selling. The trust purchases the company, generally purchases the shares of the company that's being sold and becomes the shareholder. And so again, indirectly, they become the owner of the business. Now, for the vendors, if everything is structured properly, the vendor can get a couple good things coming out of this, really. The big tax incentive is if it's structured properly, you get the $10 million capital gains deduction on the sale, which is quite an incentive. the typical lifetime capital gains exemption is also still available and can be stacked with it, but that's usually more in the realm of about, I think it's $1.25 million currently for each individual, whereas the $10 million for a sale to the employee ownership trust is a considerably bigger number. So the real incentive there for the vendors. And I'll be honest with you, in our experience in discussing these EOTs with a lot of people, what's also really nice for the vendors is they are allowing their employees to take control of this company. That's a key piece of this. But they're passing the business along to those employees who have helped them be successful. And usually if you have, business owners who are invested in their employees, this is a nice vehicle for them to get the employees involved and watch that business continue, hopefully to flourish in their communities. Often if you sell it to a competitor or private equity, they may come in and scoop up what they want and leave. But if you sell it to an EOT, well, it's owned indirectly by the employees. So they're very invested in staying in their community and watching the business succeed. And so for vendors who are of that mindset, that's a very nice vehicle for them.
So it sounds like there are potential advantages for both employees and employers.
That is correct.
So you've been involved in EOTs from the ground up. Can you walk us through how these EOTs came to be legislated in Canada and your role in that process?
Yeah, no, it was an interesting process. Just through various connections in the legal tax community, got to know an individual who was working at a private equity firm. They were in Toronto, although there's a number of them spread out across the country who are, I will say, more socially minded, more interested in, employee ownership, more interested in doing transactions and supporting businesses that have good social purposes, whether it can be people who are, have disabilities or disadvantaged or groups like that. So these people try to facilitate these transactions. And of course, everybody is intending to make money on these, maybe not as much money as a pure private deal, but intending to make money on these things. And so, coming up with the right structures to allow these groups to succeed. And some of the people out of Toronto in particular, there are these do exist in the US and and more recently in the UK. And so some of these business advisors and socially minded private equity firms were involved in these transactions. Let's say one of the key ones was in the US, and they saw how employees took over a successful private US business and just the benefits that was flowing to the employees, whether it's effectively taking more middle class people, but allowing them to participate in the growth and value of these companies, which really helps them in their retirement when you've worked for 20 or 30 years at a business and you're, as part of that business, getting a piece of the growth of that. And when you turn to retire, you have some value there that you can cash in. Or also just the ability to participate in the profits of the business. When the profits company does well, these employees are doing well, which again are mostly middle class people, and allowing them to get access to that in a way that they otherwise could not is a very positive social, good things for our society, good things for our communities. And they saw that in the US, and then they started studying it more closely. And then in the UK, there's been something similar launched maybe 15 years ago. But as it evolved in the last, let's say, 10 years, it's taken off in the UK. And there's been a lot of businesses in the UK that have gone to this structure. So they looked at this and said, well, these are our two major markets where we certainly look at as our peers. And we say, well, why don't we have something like that in Canada? And they started looking at this and talking to, kind of developing a group internally in Canada of people who might be interested in advocating for this. And they started putting this forward. And then, of course, tax is so implicated in this, at least in the way we've structured our economy in Canada. Tax is so key to this that they needed some tax help. And so they reached out and said, well, would you be interested in just helping us with some concepts here? Like what is a trust? How does that work for tax purposes? And how do we need to modify the trust to make something like this work in Canada? And so we kind of we became involved in the background, just commenting on things and chatting with them. And ultimately they did make pitches to broadly based groups. So they were certainly talking to finance, which is the federal finance department, which is the kind of the bureaucracy that advises the Minister of Finance on various matters. And they're very well thought out group who brings forward fiscal policy in Canada. And so they were interested. And then, of course, this group was also talking to political parties. We were not talking to the politicians. And actually, we didn't talk directly with finance either, although we were looking at some of the proposals they were coming up with. But talked to the political parties, and there was, broad-based support against all the major parties. There was Conservative, Liberal, NDP. Because, you're taking small or medium-sized businesses, potentially family businesses, and allowing employees to benefit from this. So it's a very easy story to say, wow, if this works, this is a really positive thing. Yeah. And so, again, we were advising on the background. And eventually, so because of all this interest, and it was outlined in a budget a few years back saying we're looking at this. And then, In a subsequent budget, they said, well, here's some proposed legislation. And we were commenting on the legislation because this is all coming through the Income Tax Act. So we were looking at the Income Tax Act provisions they were saying and said, well, here are some issues. Can you fix this? To which finance was actually quite receptive. And they did change some things to make the rules more beneficial. And then ultimately, so they had these proposals and the structure was kind of outlined, which is good. But then ultimately they did follow up with a bit of an incentive, the kind of income tax kicker, which is the $10 million capital gains deduction for the vendors, which really, I think, brought a lot of more interest to these EOTs and made it really something that vendors would look closely at. So yeah, we were certainly involved right from the get-go. And I don't think we're done. I think, as these EOT structures get put into place or as roadblocks are come across, I think they'll be modified a little bit, though we do have certainly the bones of it here and there. Overall, there's some issues to work through, but there are overall quite a positive set of rules.
That's an interesting story. I often say that the business lawyers are not necessarily the ones who get to create law. Often it's our friends who go down to the courthouse who get to create law. So it's interesting to me that someone like you has had the benefit of the business background and the business experience, and you were able to have input into a structure that really is novel and innovative here in Canada and has the potential to create some real impact.
Yeah, I agree with that. And certainly we've had a team of people here working at Bennett Jones with me. There's 3 or 4 of us. And yeah, that's certainly the comment we've had internally, and certainly from some of the some of our junior members is to say, well, geez, we always thought sending submissions to finance was like a mission impossible. We actually when we made thoughtful comments, they did react. So it was actually quite, from our perspective, quite gratifying to see that. For sure.
Great. Well, as you know, on this podcast, entitled Beyond Succession, we focus on topics as they apply to family enterprises. So perhaps you could comment on what types of businesses are best suited to consider an EOT structure, and perhaps you could comment on whether family-owned businesses are a fit for this.
Yeah, I think the market's still evolving. It's so new that we have to see what businesses this will work for. I think in theory it could work for almost any businesses. We certainly, in the services area, we've seen a lot of, whether we've talked to mining services groups, we've talked to people who are supporting theater groups involved in the arts, where you have employees are very invested in the company and you have an owner saying, I don't know who to sell this to. My employees are maybe the only person I can sell this to. So yeah, the market is still evolving. I think probably a couple of key pieces that we've noticed in terms of people who are interested. And I think the people that you need to succeed, you do need to have enough cash flow for 2 purposes, because you got to buy the vendor out.
Right. So
you need enough money in there to fund that purchase over a timeline that the vendor can accept. There are rules that allow the vendor, in income tax rules here, to allow the vendor to take that money over 10 years. But that's a long time. And would a vendor be interested in taking it over 10 years? More common is generally 5 or less. So you need enough cash flow to make sure the vendor's getting paid, but also that there are still enough profits to go out to those employees who are now the beneficiaries, the indirect owners of this, that they can see the incentive, that they can, they're okay, we're participating in the profits in this and we're benefiting from this. With the carrot being that once the vendor's paid out, well, then all the profits are coming up to us. But you kind of need enough to make it go both ways. And then the other key piece that we've seen is generally the vendors have to be interested in this. It's a friendly deal. Right. Like the vendor is effectively setting up the EOT trust and putting the structure into place. The employees, the only way this works is if the employees understand the business and are senior enough and know enough to take over the business. Sometimes in family businesses, the family runs the business so closely that it's hard to transition that to employees.
Right.
Doesn't mean an EOT can't work, but you have to be thoughtful about it and say, okay, well, if we're going to do this EOT, and we're going to do it in, let's say, 5 years, we want to retire. We got to start involving these people in the decisions and thinking about, putting them in the position to have the information and to know what's going on here, and the right training to be able to take it over. There's a bit of expense, for the vendor to set it all up, but it's a friendly deal. So it makes it a little bit easier to happen. But you do have to probably have a vendor who's interested in their employees in that and interested in having those discussions and to make it work.
Right. So, you've touched on a couple of things there about, the vendor giving up control. You've talked about the employees being in the know and being able to take over and operate the business going forward. From a succession perspective, how do EOTs compare to other exit options like third-party sales or management buyouts? Like, it seems to me that some of this would have to happen regardless of what succession vehicle you chose. Are you able to
Yeah.
comment on the similarities or the differences?
Yeah, I mean, it is effectively a sale of the business. So
Right.
the vendor has to be ready for that. And you pointed out something, a key point there that I should highlight, and that we've certainly had these discussions with the vendors, is you got to give up control on
Yeah.
the sale to the
Yeah.
EOT. So you can't say, well, I'm going to sell you 40% now. You can't do an EOT that way. You do have to give up the 50% plus one. You can still stick around. You can still be a minority shareholder, and you
Right.
can still be involved with the trust. You can be a trustee of the trust. You can't be more than 40%. You can still be on the board of directors of the company, but you can't be more than 40%. So you got to be comfortable with giving up control. That's a big hurdle. Yeah, and then you got to get your employees trained, and they got to understand what they're getting into.
Right. So, but I think you'd need to be in that mindset or have given thought to those concepts if you were going to sell outright to a third party. Right.
Absolutely.
You'd be giving up control, and you'd need to have people who are able to, take the business forward. Presumably some of those people are important enough that you would want them to stick around after a third party sale.
Yeah, that's right. So you're right. It's very similar in that sense.
Yeah.
And you can stay involved, maybe more so even than a pure third party sale, because if you sell it to a third party, maybe they want you to be involved in the business for 2 years, but they don't want you to be a shareholder. So in some ways, there's more flexibility.
Yeah.
If it's a vendor and they're quite invested in their employees, the concern with a third party sale is, I mean, maybe you know the third party quite well. Sometimes, they're competitors and you've been competing with them for years and you kind of understand how they operate. But the concern always for a lot of this is the vendor, and we've seen this many times where the third party purchaser comes in, buys it, gets the IP or gets the piece of it that they want, or just a few key employees, puts it together with their existing business and kind of shuts down what's going on. And so, if you're like, let's say a small manufacturer in a small town somewhere and you're very successful at what you do, you're very good at it. But these competitors, there's some special sauce you have, and that's what they really want. Well, they'll get that special sauce and they'll leave.
Right.
Whereas with the EOT and you sell it to the employees, they're going to stick around.
Right.
The research that's been done on this is that these, employee-owned businesses are generally very successful, and they're obviously owned by the employees, so the employees' interests are kind of at the forefront. So when you have a tough time, when you have a recession, they don't go and lay everyone off. They kind of say, well, we got to spread the pain around here. We're not going to make as much money for a few years, but let's stick together and we'll get through this. Right. And then they're very well positioned when things turn around to jump on those opportunities because they haven't left and they haven't closed down everything or they haven't sold everything. Right.
And haven't lost all their valuable mind and management, right? The people who've got the know-how who can keep the place running and exploit opportunities in the future.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then if you compare it with an employee buyout,
yeah,
what's difficult for employee buyouts is they got to come up with the money. The management,
right.
Usually it's debt, right? So if you're the senior management, you want to take over the company, well, you gotta go take a loan,
right? Probably,
probably,
yeah.
And that's a bit scary. Whereas with the EOT, there might be a loan; it would be to the business effectively to maybe pay the vendor a bit of an upfront amount. But this is all funded with as long as you're comfortable that the company's profitable and you can model out that okay, we're going to be making money over the next few years. It's those profits that fund the purchase price, which makes it a heck of a lot easier for the senior management to participate, but also the other employees. So they get to come in as beneficiaries without having to take the risk. Well, in a sense, they are the indirect owners, but they don't have to go out and take a loan and buy shares. And how do I fund that? And do I, my kids are going to...
What security do I have to give for that? And, what risk am I doing with my own assets? And what happens to my house?
Precisely. So that's which is a big benefit for employees. So
right. Okay. So let's talk about the deal that you worked on, which was the first Canadian EOT transaction. So you assisted with the EOT for Grant Book. What made that transaction successful, and what learnings can we take from that our listeners might benefit from?
Yeah. So this is an interesting one. So TOS had the hallmarks of an EOT, like they had some actual employee ownership of the entity of Grant Book before the ownership, and was deeply invested in the employees, very interested in the employees doing well. And ultimately they were actually kind of operating in the background when all these EOTs were rolling out, saying, yeah, we're very supportive of this. This is a great idea. So they were invested in their employees, invested in the business, thought they wanted the employees to take over. So that was a key piece to this. And so, management was fully involved in the business, fully understood what was going on. So very well placed to take it over. So I think with those two things in mind, we didn't really know. I mean, I know when we started out with the transaction, some of the discussions we had with Grant Book is to say, like, look, the owner here does want to exit. Everybody's invested in this EOT. We know this is the first one. But if this doesn't work, is there another exit we can go to? And we said, well, yes, at Bennett Jones, we have the expertise. We'll get you there. That's what you got to do. But to be honest with you, once we got into the discussions of the EOT, it just went very smoothly because everybody's interests were aligned, and management and the employees who are going to be effectively taking over this company were very comfortable with the business and what they were getting themselves into. There's always interesting stuff. You have to, it is just a regular trust, but there has to be certain requirements in that trust. For example, how are the profits to be split up?
Right.
And so there's a bunch of discussions that need to happen there, with both the vendor, but also the management team and kind of, the employees have to have some knowledge of this. So you've got to have those discussions, and there's some complexity in that. And how do you implement that, and having a little bit of flexibility there to make it work, but at the same time, the employees understanding what the benefit that they're going to get into. But again, because everybody's interests on Grant Book were very aligned, it went very well. But you got to develop also some governance. I mean, the employees, if they're indirect owners via the trust, they need to have some information as to what's going on with the business and how the financials are working. And so building the governance structure to do that, it just took some discussions. But to be honest with you, the transaction went quite smoothly because of the aligned interests.
So it sounds like this trust agreement that creates the EOT itself, given that you're talking about governance and you're talking about employees having direct interest in that and distribution of profits out, it sounds like some of those components are similar to a unanimous shareholder agreement that you'd need to put into place if you had a different kind of employee share ownership structure.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's certainly, and there again, given the flexibility here, you can have because the EOT has to control, but it doesn't have to have all the shares. Right. So there is probably a USA there, and there is, often a USA below the EOT. But yeah, no, there's an interplay there between certainly the unanimous shareholders agreement, what are the terms of that, but also that has to coordinate and work with the trust deed provisions. And that's where you can see where there could be some negotiation as to how that plays out.
Right.
But if the values are aligned, you just got to find the words and find the concepts and then get them down onto paper, which is what we do as lawyers in a way that works out for everybody.
Right. So it sounds like that particular transaction went fairly smoothly because everyone was aligned. Where are areas of complexity? We've touched on governance. We've touched on the terms of the trust deed. Are there other complexities that people need to keep in mind when they're considering implementing an EOT? And what kind of inputs do they need to manage those complexities? What advisors do they need for that?
So there's a couple pieces there, the complexity and the advisors. So depending on the size of these, again, we're still figuring out how this works. You do certainly need lawyers because you need to settle a trust deed. You need to, you need to do a purchase and sale agreement. If there's a loan, you need to have security. You need to figure out how the money is going to flow in terms of, and that's, legally, like, right. Are they dividends? Are they loans? Or all this structuring? And certain people, the EOT has trustees, and those trustees will have fiduciary duties to the beneficiaries. So they have to make sure they understand what they're getting themselves into by entering into the purchase and sale agreement. So you certainly obviously need lawyers. The other pieces that we've seen, though, are somebody who handles the softer side, like the governance at the EOT, and how do you involve the employees in the governance, and how do you structure. And that doesn't necessarily have to be legal, but how there's a sharing of information so the employees know what's going on in the business and what's going on with the EOT. Now, certainly you have an employee who is the trustee of the EOT, and likely, some of those people will know who are on the board of directors of the company. So there should be a natural flow of information, but you got to have some thought about that. So we've seen lawyers, kind of the softer skills in terms of the governance. And then we've also some of these socially minded private equity firms. This is what they do. They're quite on top of the tax rules as well. They're not lawyers, but they're very on top of the tax rules. But they can help them, if the business is big enough, model out how this works. How does the money flow? What is the time frame that the vendor is going to be paid out on? Given the nature of your business and your employee group, how do you split up the profits? Is it some sort of based on salary? Is it based on years of service? There's certain permitted grounds that you're allowed to divide up the profits under the tax legislation, but within that, there's a lot of flexibility. And so how do you structure that? So we have seen these private equity firms, and they're very helpful. Again, they're socially minded, so they're generally if there's an alignment of values, this all kind of works out. But we've certainly seen them as well involved in the transaction, and that can make things go quite smoothly. And they can have those preliminary discussions. That's can we, but they can also have those preliminary discussions with the business to say, maybe the cash flows here don't work, or maybe the family involvement you want to continue to have. Maybe that won't work for an EOT. But if you can see but then they can also, if you can see this over 5 years or 10 years, maybe the EOT is a structure for you down the road.
Right.
So yeah, that's kind of the 3 buckets we've seen.
Got it. So let's pick up on that governance piece and the soft skills you talked about. You've mentioned here in your remarks that one of the things that can be attractive about an EOT is that it can allow for really broad participation of employees who may not all be executive employees. And in fact, probably a lot of them might not be executive employees. So they're not
Correct.
necessarily folks who would be privy to or who would have all of the information shared with them that they now will be managing and interpreting and trying to figure out how to make decisions about. So I would think based on, those facts that governance is pretty critical in these trust-based models. And so what should family enterprise owners know about the ongoing oversight and management? And what do the employees need to know about that? What kind of special things would need to be factored in?
So ultimately, it is the trust. That's the shareholder of the business. And so the trustees they're making decisions on behalf of the trust. And so they are voting those shares. And so you can, if you control, you can remove the directors and, you can take all these kinds of steps. And so one of the things we've advised on this is you got to have the right people as the trustees. And so you can train the employees to be they can be the sole trustees if that's the direction you go. But if the group is not maybe sophisticated enough to handle that, because you do have to have governance and you do have to have trustee meetings, and you got to follow a bit of a form to this to make sure this you can't be too loosey goosey in this.
Right.
And so one of the things we've certainly talked about is you're allowed to have certain effectively professional trustees, bank trustees. Be a trustee of this, that's permitted. And so if you're not comfortable with your employees and maybe they're not sophisticated enough to run these types of things, the employees certainly have to have a representative, but it probably makes sense to have someone like that, like a professional trustee that can bring the rigor and the discipline, take the minutes, do those kinds of things when you have these meetings so that everything is properly documented, decisions are properly made, information is properly translated. I think that's a key is kind of that governance, because that's really ultimately the shareholders, and they need to, operate in a certain way and at a certain level to make it successful. And then the second part is really, your board of directors and your USA and those types of documents. You got to have the right people on the board of directors who can effectively run the business.
Right.
And again, that coming back to some of the points we talked about earlier, you hope there are employees who are senior enough and who are on that board of directors and know what's going on. But if there aren't, if it's families, and this takes, I think, a few years to do, quite frankly, you got to get those employees involved so that they can become directors and they can take on those responsibilities and understand the technicalities of what they have to do, but also, the softer pieces as to what that means and having information.
This sounds a lot like, the transition that takes place when a family business transitions between generations, right? As soon as you have more people and you have people who may not all have the same level of information or the same understanding or the same role, then you really have to give some careful thought to what information gets shared with people who may have an ownership interest, what kind of decisions they get to make, when that information is shared with them so that they have enough time to consider it or to ask questions. Structure your meeting processes so that there are opportunities for questions before people have to make the decision, et cetera. It sounds like there are a lot of commonalities here if you put an EOT in place that there would be if you transition from one group of owners to another.
Yeah, I can't put it any better than what you just said. Yeah, absolutely. All that stuff applies here.
So you made a comment earlier about how these EOTs or companies that have these EOTs as owners have historically been quite successful. So I want to ask a question that I think is related to that. How does employee ownership through an EOT change the culture or engagement in a business?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's all fact specific to your business, but what the studies have said and the reviews of this have said, it's just a fundamentally different mindset. If you're an employee somewhere, you're an employee. But if you're an employee and an indirect owner, well, it's a heck of a lot different. If you see that something's not working as well as it could,
right.
If you're a part owner, you might say, well, geez, if we could fix this machine, if we had this better process for how we're approaching things, if we maybe there's an untapped market that I think we should, go after, that maybe as an employee, you're not as incentivized to care about it. Well, if you're an indirect owner, you are directly interested in that, which can lead to a lot of, just naturally leads to a lot of good things. I mean, one of the things even in our law firm, we try to incentivize is people to recognize, as certainly as partners, but also our hopeful future partners as associates, that, hey, you could be a part owner of this business. So, which changes your mentality, right?
Right.
And you think longer term. So I think I'm a lawyer, not a social scientist or something, but from what I've read in the area and been told by others who are much smarter than I, that there's a lot of positive things from changing that mindset. And so that these businesses are generally quite successful and quite sticky in their communities. And I think that's important.
Yeah.
For the family businesses and for some of our smaller communities and certainly all across the country, we have a real successful little business, but then you can't figure out who can take that business over. Maybe the family's disinterested or there's no one in the family who is qualified to take it over. What do you do with these things? And the EOT is a very alluring structure to do that. Not to say you can't have a huge EOT. Like I will be interesting to see how big a company can be taken over by an EOT.
Right.
I don't think there's really a limit on the size. And I think if you have the right kind of company and if you could get some private equity money to take a piece of the company with you, but the EOT has to control, obviously, then, the sky's the limit as to how big it can get. So,
right. So I take it from your comments that you think the model's here to stay.
I do. Yeah, I do. I think we need some tweaks in some of the areas and this gets into very tax stuff. And this is, one of the questions you asked earlier, which maybe I didn't answer. Where's the complexity in this? Part of the complexity is making sure the business and the EOT qualifies under the EOT requirements. And some of that is, what's the existing structure and how do we get to an EOT?
Right.
And so the existing structure, how people hold these things, whether it's through family trusts, which are generally fine, but a lot of people use holding companies, and holding companies can bring some complexity. There are ways to work around it, but we would like to see some tweaks to the legislation for that. And so that's where a fair bit of complexity is saying, okay, here's your structure now. We can get you to an EOT, but we got to do some steps to get there. And then the other piece that, I probably should have mentioned earlier off the top is that currently the $10 million capital gains deduction is set to expire in 2027.
Oh, that's soon.
So exactly. 22. So you got 20. We're already almost halfway through 2025 here. 2026. So it does technically expire in 2027. So we do need that incentive to be pushed out forever. And I think there certainly is a big push amongst the community who is advocating for these things to get that done. And I think there's probably an appetite if we can see some successes. For example, Grant Book is if we can get some successes in this area, that maybe we would see that pushed out. But that is a key piece that needs to change, because as we've been talking about, and as you said very eloquently just moments ago, succession is not something you do tomorrow. Succession is something you got to be thinking about 2, 3, ideally 5 or 10 years out. And so I think there are a lot of businesses that can qualify for an EOT, and you can qualify for an EOT without claiming the capital gains deduction, but obviously
that's a big incentive. Why would you give it up if you didn't have to?
Exactly. And so, we got to have these rules set, and that $10 million capital gain should be available so that people can have these discussions. And, and I think there'll be a big market for these in, 5, 10 years. And I do think the model will stick around, because I think once a bunch of these transactions occur and there's some comfort with them, I mean, if you're interested in your employees and you want to pass the business along, there's a lot of positives here.
Right. What would you say to a family enterprise considering whether an EOT is the right succession strategy?
I think it's another arrow in the quiver is what I would say. So we've talked about a bunch of them here. Does the business stay in the family? Do you sell it to a competitor? Do you sell it to private equity? Sometimes you might be in a position you don't know who the heck to sell it to at all. But so the EOT is in that mix. And I think it absolutely is something you should consider. And there are incentives. Certainly the $10 million capital gains deduction is a big one. But also if you're invested in your employees and you have a group that you quite like, I think you got to look at this option for sure. Great.
Well, Wes, this has been a great discussion. I thank you so much for sharing your experience and your insights with us. I think it will be very valuable to our listeners. Thanks so much for appearing on the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Leah. It's always, as I said, a pleasure to talk about EOTs and always a pleasure to talk with you.
Well, thank you.
Thanks for joining me on this episode of Beyond Succession, a series within the Bennett Jones Business Law Talks podcast. Make sure to hit the follow button on whatever platform you are listening from so you get notified whenever we release new episodes. Also, don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions about challenges or issues that you are facing in your family enterprise. Take care. I'll catch you in our next episode.